but most of my work to date has been in New South Wales. Priam, who I'll introduce to you later on, was a colleague of mine and has since moved over to the Department of Planning and Environment in the state government. So she'll bring a different kind of perspective to the work that she used to do when she was working for the university. So yeah, I came to one of the courses last year, the 4th year design course, and I spoke more about the Hunter River as a specific case study because the guys there were working down in Carrington. This talk is a little bit more broad focused, and I guess a bit more coming from the climate change sort of perspective and large scale sort of engineering infrastructure and stuff that we've done across our estuaries. And then Prem will kind of bring into the more flooding and local site issues that you have down there at Rockdale. So yeah, I guess the key word in this kind of talk is really about the future and what kind of we're planning towards and what our horizons are, and particularly thinking about the context of the future when we have a changing baseline. And so what we mean by that is if we know what the water levels are doing out there every day, and that's very consistent, which it has been for a long time now, we can easily plan for what we start to do on our landscape. If things start changing, like we have sea level rise and other conditions in the environment that are changing, it makes those planning issues much more complex. So as you might have already seen from your work to date, we've got climate change is at the forefront of everything we're doing these days. And despite everything being discussed, we're currently on track for greenhouse gas emissions to see a 3-degree or so increase in temperatures. They're saying by 2025 that we are likely going to see global average temperatures go above 1.5 degrees Celsius for the first time. So no matter what happens, sea level rise is actually going to happen, and it's going to happen fast, and we're going to have to plan for something major to happen in the future. And so the most recent IPCC report suggests that we're on track for the, one of these kind of medium planning horizon scenarios, and we need to plan for at least 1 metre of sea level rise. Prem will go into a little bit more detail about how sea level rise is going to affect your specific site, but thinking more broadly, that's not the only site you guys are going to work on in the future. So you have to have this kind of understanding about what is happening and around your site, as well as how that's going to impact your sites. So what does history tell us? How have we reacted to extreme events in the past? Climate change really is an extreme event. You can think about it like that. And we're going to see more extreme events as we move forward into the future. As you know, 2019, we saw, the driest years on record and extreme bushfires, which I'll touch on a little bit more lately. And then last year in Sydney, we saw the wettest year on record. So from the driest to the wettest, we're seeing extreme events happen more frequently now. And so up until sort of about the 1950s, our main solution was large-scale engineering works. So we would go out and build and design infrastructure that could fix these problems, like dams or large-scale flood mitigation and other sort of large-scale tidal barrages. I'm not sure, Patrick, have you shown them the stuff over in the Netherlands yet? Around? No. Okay, so yeah. So you'll come across information where different countries have approached these problems in different ways. And the Netherlands is a classic example of where they've just gone ahead and built large-scale tidal barrages to sort of control their water levels. So then if we look up and down the east coast of Australia, particularly, which is sort of more my focus, up on the Tweed River, all these red lines on this map here is where we've gone out and we've dug drainage channels across the floodplain. So we have also, in our estuaries, we've gone and straightened our channels. We've built breakwalls. So you can see here, this is the Tweed River, and this is the Tweed River entrance where it comes out here. And so at the end of the Tweed River entrance, we've gone and built some breakwaters. That has had other coastal engineering issues, but it's also changed the way that our estuary functions and operates as well. So we build these hard walls sometimes around our systems to make them more stable and to control what is happening, as well as allowing humans to do more with the land behind those hard structures. So in the Hunter River, which I touched on last year, you can see from this sort of 1801 sort of map of the floodplain and the mouth of the estuary to what it is today. We've gone ahead and we've dredged river channels, we've reclaimed lands, we've changed the shape of the estuary as well. And Botany Bay is no different. It looks nothing like really what it did in its natural state. And you know, people can argue whether that's better or worse. But it does create issues, and we have to continue to plan for the issues that are happening around these estuaries. So from the 1960s onwards, we kept engineering the landscape, but most of these major sort of pieces of engineering were less focused on flooding and more about how we could use the land better and make it work better for us. And so flood mitigation, again, is just the classic example of before and after that constructed drainage. Obviously, we've got these large extreme events where we're seeing, you know, impact to life and infrastructure that people care about along the coastline. And so what are we starting to do now in terms of emergency response to these bushfires and flooding events that are happening? Instead of sort of that large-scale engineering focus of how can we go and dig a drain or train an entrance, we've really started focusing on human health and how can we manage that risk to life. And so these extreme events that we've been having, particularly after the bushfires, you may remember, a lot of the work was really focused in the last sort of during the event and the 100 days after the event of, do we have enough services? Do we have enough fire trucks on the ground? Do we have enough ways of dealing with specific bushfires that are happening across the area? So it's very much more kind of, we weren't thinking as much about how do we stop the bushfire from happening as much as it is how do we sort of respond to these events as they happen. And so instead of zooming out and focusing on the big picture, we're really zooming in and looking at how we respond in the days and during and after those major events. And so what happens next? Will we continue to focus on evacuation and that kind of mitigation while the baseline is starting to shift? Or we start thinking about this kind of large-scale engineering infrastructure again and how we can sort of prevent sea level rise impacting the areas that we currently inhabit. And then what do we think about? So is it 2050, 2070 and beyond? What is our planning horizon and what is important to think about over those timeframes? So this is something that Prem might have a little bit more to say on as well. But in terms of New South Wales right now, and particularly in terms of planning we have some new coastal zone management plans, and the current best practice is really a 10-year focus. This does limit our ability to think long term, particularly when, as I keep saying, this baseline is changing. We don't actually know what sea level rise is going to be. We have good, strong predictions, but we still don't know what that baseline is going to be. So we may need to sort of take small actions now that will offset sort of what is happening in the future. And just go to the next one. So there's a few different options. Status quo is we just let everything just play out as it's happening now, and we just see what happens. Which is not really an option. We know that that's not an option because we're starting to see these extreme events and there are issues coming about from that. Retreat has not really been politically acceptable. Some people have had to do that where there has been a direct impact to life. For example, in my hometown, there's a beach up there at Old Bar where they've lost something like 70 metres in the last 20 years in terms of the coastal dune that was in front of their houses. And so there was no option to protect that shoreline. So those houses had to be moved and those people had to be moved. So retreat was the only option there. Now that those houses have been, the front line of houses have been moved, the next line of houses are actually starting to go, okay, well, what are our options? Are we going to have to move too, or can we build some kind of wall or do something else that would protect our situation? So that's where a couple of other options happen. Can we adapt to the changing environmental conditions? But that then means if you look around, even just look out this window here, you can see so many buildings and pieces of infrastructure that you'd need to adapt to account for those changing conditions that may not be the best solution moving forward, potentially really expensive, and who pays? The protection option is also a highly costed option, but you start to think about, okay, well, what are we protecting for? If we do something now, is that going to be enough to protect us in the future? Then you also have the option of, well, what happens if you think about it from a restoration perspective? Some areas this might be feasible, and it may actually help us to reduce the impacts of, say, sea level rise on our sites. But it also comes from the different angle of taking carbon out of the atmosphere and trying to prevent the problem getting worse than what it is, or the trajectory that it's on today. So just in a little bit more detail, this adapt option is kind of interesting because you have to individually prioritize, plan and engineer and then maintain every piece of infrastructure that's at risk. So each one of those little red dots on that map there is a piece of infrastructure that you have to go out and assess and plan a risk strategy for. And so huge resources are required to do that, but it's sort of spent slowly over a long period of time. And so that capacity to future-proof these sort of areas and infrastructure of concern is a little bit unknown. If we think about protection, which comes to sort of something I think you're going to talk about a bit more next week, is if you think about, say, the Thames River Barrier or these areas over in the Netherlands, large investments into big scale infrastructure that could be used to control the water levels that we see in our systems. For example, if I said to you, let's go and build a tidal barrage across Sydney Harbour, does that scare you? Does that seem realistic? I mean, they do that in different places. And is that what we need to start thinking about? Or do we go around Sydney Harbour and build the seawall that exists around the edges of Sydney Harbour and raise that by a metre to stop sea level rise going into Rushcutters Bay or into the city? Or what is the option? Or do we not do any of those things, and do we go to each of the pieces of infrastructure and we try and, I don't know, build a wall around every building in a city? It's like we need to start thinking about how we are planning for this risk that can come from, say, sea level rise specifically. Prem will talk more about the flooding, which is coming from the other direction in the catchment. So this is really just giving you some ideas. And so the work that I have been doing is typically out on more regional floodplains. I have done some work in urban wetlands, but it's a little bit more complicated. But the work out in regional areas is where you have a little bit more room to move, and you're basically taking what was, say, a wetland or an area that was, that is less urban, and you can recreate a wetland space there. And so in that kind of situation, you can think a little bit bigger picture, and there's a little bit more room to move in terms of what your design could look like. So this work that we've been doing in large-scale restoration sites really has come from 20 plus years of testing on-ground methods and outcomes, and we've done a lot of work around assessing the cost benefit of how much does it cost to go and do the restoration, and what is the benefit to the environment and the people that use these systems. So some of the work that we've done in New South Wales has showed that there's a 7:1 benefit to cost ratio. So highly positive returns sort of within that decade timeframe in terms of you go and spend the money to do the studies to understand your site, to actually change the site from what it was to what it could be, and within a decade you've paid that bill off. And so then from that point forward, you start seeing this kind of the environment starting to improve, and you have what's called ecosystem services. So the way that my work really works is I focus on the water. I focus on how water moves, how long it's going to be on the site for, how much water is going to be on the site. From that, you then start to understand, okay, how that might change the sort of biogeochemical sort of processes and functioning of the site, what the microbes are doing, what the bigger organisms are doing, and then how they sort of interact with the flora and fauna at a larger sort of scale. But the key aspect of my work is really once you get the water right, the other things do tend to follow a very sort of natural process of restoration after that. And that's something that you guys can consider at your site too. You know, if you can get the water right on your site, that then will allow where that water's going, how long it's going to be there for, up and down tides. That will then help you work out what parts of your site may require different restoration strategies. Then comes what Prem will talk to you about, which is the flooding, and how flooding might then impact your site and how you handle that water on your site as well, which is more of a short-term thing, short-term event. Yes, so this slide really just is a bit of a summary. So if we're thinking about, you know, in 100 years' time, what are our solutions and who's going to pay for it, and what is kind of the outcome of each of those solutions. So you might also want to, sometimes it's helpful to put yourself forward into the future and say, okay, well, if I was in 2150 right now and I was looking back and reflecting on what's happening today, then you might ask yourself a question, well, what happens if we don't get to net zero emissions in the next, by 2030? You know, shouldn't we have a backup plan if we don't actually achieve that target and that goal? And this kind of idea of that shifting baseline, well, if we don't know what is the future is going to be in terms of sea levels and rainfall and temperature and other things that are going to affect your site, well then, how do we design for that? You know, if the ground's constantly moving, how do you come up with a stable solution? And so does that mean we start to over-design our sites? Which is interesting because when we talked about the Carrington site last year in this class, there were some pretty wild sort of final designs, but when you actually sat there and you thought about it, you're like, that actually could work, and maybe we do need solutions like that. Maybe we need to start thinking about these things in a different way to what we have been doing. And can we make these sites adaptable? So it's not only you know, coming up with a design, but how flexible can your design be to work with that changing baseline, which is probably the most critical sort of part of the design process in the conditions that we're living in now. And so this other idea about who's paying for things, you know, do we start putting a little bit of money aside now so that in the future we have a big bank account, or do we have to just you know, find money somewhere today that is paying for these large-scale protection sort of solutions, and you know, then maintaining that into the future, and this other idea about what is an acceptable planning time frame. You know, we have to think about you know, what's happening not only in the next 10 years, but what is going to happen in the next 100 years, and how adaptable are our sites for that to happen. And so, yeah, this kind of touching on trying to get you big thinking ideas happening is like, you know, are large-scale tidal barrages, you know, a solution for what we're talking about? Is that kind of being over-designed, or is that applicable? We've also got this idea of the rising sea levels and what is actually what is that going to do to our systems? So a key actual thing to think about, which is some work that a colleague of ours, Kate Waddington's been doing for her PhD, is this idea of changing sea levels is not only going to mean that you're going to have higher high tide levels, but you're also going to have higher low tide levels. So that's then going to affect drainage of your sites. And that might also affect flooding, which Priyam will touch on later. And so you see here on the Tweed River, just as an example, if you go and put sea level rise, then these sites here that are highlighted in blue, or particularly in red, is where you're going to basically change the drainage window. And the drainage window is this time that between mid-tide to low tide and back to mid-tide. That window for where you have a water level here on the floodplain, you have your water level in your estuary or your river or your creek. And if that level is shifted up, then it means the water on your floodplain or in your wetland or at your site, wherever you are, actually can't drain out of that site. And so you're seeing large areas of floodplains that people live and work on, which are going to be permanently inundated potentially, and that is causing concern in terms of how our floodplains operate into the future. And so, yeah, this is just talking about, you know, we need to consider long-term solutions for how the environment's changing and encourage different thinking as well as savings moving forward. So Priyam's also going to talk now about some flooding issues and local site issues. But if you want any more information on how climate change is affecting estuaries, then there is a series of documents that were produced by the Water Research Laboratory with partners that does provide some cool infographics and goes into some of these issues in more detail. Priyam, I'll pass it over to you now. Yeah, I think I shared them with you last time, but yeah. Do you want me to stand and click the slides? Or?
All right.
Questions after.
Okay, so my name is Priyam, and I used to also work with Jamie for UNSW Water Research Lab. I have a numerical modelling background, and I'm going to give you a completely different insight to the different things you should consider. Hopefully not contradicting what Jamie's saying, but it's always good to think about a project from different perspectives, right? Because the more informed we are, the better we will be at making decisions, right? So I'm going to talk about the Rockdale Wetland Corridor and specifically the flood risks, right? And some of this may or may not be things you've heard before, but hopefully it will help towards making your design more sustainable. Okay, so in terms of the Rockdale Wetland Corridor, so you've probably already seen this. I imagine you've been out there, I hear, but basically it falls within the Bayside LGA, and you know there's three main sort of wetland systems, but in particular we're looking at this one right here. And so you already know this, but basically it consists of several natural and altered open spaces, and this goes back to the map that Jamie was showing you about how it looked pre-colonialism, and also that you know it's very different in terms of hydraulics as well. So you have the northern sections of the corridor that's near the airport, which is highly modified, and then you have the southern sections, which is a mix of remnant and reinstated wetlands. But the important thing is that the wetlands and the salt marshes that are there at the moment provide for the ecological systems in that area. And there's heaps of documents out there that you can come and talk to me about that look at the endangered and ecological communities which they help support. So it is ecologically quite important as well. So having a look then at, what you guys are all doing, and obviously the Bayside Council's vision for the master plan that came out about 2 years ago for public consultation. So, they're trying to obviously redo this space, and this is where, you as the future landscape architects will come in with visions to, improve connections, enhance the environment, conserve culture and heritage, and facilitate for, the local amenities, essentially, which I assume you all know about. So where do I come in, right? So I'm here to talk to you about the flooding side of things. And, flooding is very topical, especially when you get like a La Nina event of last year. Everyone's talking about flooding. It's in the forefront of everybody's mind. But, more often than not, we don't really think about it, right? It's, if you're going to drought period, you won't even know which areas are flooded and which are not. So I just wanted to put some headlines in about, this actually happened in February of this year. So only a couple of months ago, there was weather warnings issued out by the Bureau of Meteorology saying there would be life-threatening floods and intense rainfall events for parts of Sydney and also the Illawarra. So sorry about the quality of this map, but this goes back to, I think it was on the 8th of February that this happened, but basically we were to expect severe thunderstorms, which were to be very dangerous. And, following that event on the 10th of February, there was articles about the massive cleanup and the aftermath of that flooding. And, there are people that lived in that Monterey area who had to vacate their house because the overland flooding was so much, their property got damaged, floodwaters entered their houses, and some of them are living in temporary accommodation as we speak, as insurance goes on to repair their houses. So I just put some statistics up about that event. So the New South Wales SES received about 1,300 calls that day, and there was about 65 different flood rescues that got carried out. So, it does happen, and whether we like to always think about it or not, but that is why we're here, right? So in my current role, I work as a technical specialist for the water floodplains and coast team at the Environment Heritage Group at DPE. And my job is to, provide support and guidance to the communities within Greater Sydney to look at and manage their flood risk. So I won't bore you with this, but it's just a bit of a background as to what we do in terms of flooding in New South Wales. So Jamie talked about, CMP, so the coastal management plans usually have a 10-year horizon. But when it comes to flood risk, we've been doing this since about the 1970s, when Sydney and Greater Sydney saw severe flooding happen in both the Parramatta and the Georges River catchment. So we've been doing this for a while, and I guess by law, local governments are required under Section 733 to protect their residents from flooding, right? It's a legal requirement. And if they don't do it, then, as a resident, you are well within your rights to go and question your council about, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you do something, right? So to do that, we do that under the New South Wales government's flood-prone land policy. So me and my team, we put out technical guidance, and this is just the most recent one, but there's previous versions that go back to all the way to the 70s. But basically, it talks about flood risk management, and there's several guides, and if you print it out, it's about this big. So if you have insomnia and want to, fall asleep, I recommend it for bedtime reading, right? So there is guidance out there, and again, not many people know about this unless you work in this space. Even as water engineers, when you think about flooding, you think about stormwater and drainage networks in pipes. And, often when I go into community meetings, they go, oh, but, we could improve our flooding by making the drains bigger. But, that's not the case, because councils design your stormwater systems for very frequent events, right? So your day-to-day rainfall. So we're talking about your, 1 in 20 year type events. And often, it's not an option to make them give them flood immunity till, for rarer events, because often they're restricted by, sewage networks or cables or, a whole list of other things that happen in urban areas, right? And you don't want to be doing that either, because, it's not financially viable for councils to do that kind of work, right? And sorry if I'm being a bit technical, please stop me. This is a very informal conversation, right? When we talk about things like 1 in 100 year flood or 1 in 20 year floods, we're not actually talking about a flood that will happen 1 in 100 years. That's a very common misconception. We're talking about a flood that has a 1% chance of happening this year, a 1% chance of happening next year, a 1% chance of happening the year after, a 1% chance of happening the year after that. And the reason we talk about exceedance probabilities like that in engineering, like I said, councils, when you design a stormwater network, you design it for, you're expecting a risk of 20%. So, 1 in 5 events, you're expecting that system to fail and not work, right? But that's the level of risk. And when we're talking about rare events that, potentially are very hazardous to, human life and property, we're willing to accept a 1% risk. That's what we mean when we talk about the 1 in 100-year flood. So that's an important definition to kind of put into your head. So in terms of the management process, I won't go into it, but these things take decades, right? We've been studying all of Sydney. There's about 100 catchment, and this just happens to be one of them. But where we go in, we collect flood data every time a flood happens. We study the hydrology and hydraulics, and we build numerical models to understand what the flood behavior is in that catchment. We then go and do a management study where we go, okay, now that we know where our floods, what can we do to make it better? Do we, make the drain bigger? Do we put a tidal gate in? Do we, put a detention basin in? Or if we can't engineer our way out of the problem, we might want to look at other things. Like, do we put planning controls where we tell people that are building there, you want to build your place higher, or you don't want to build things like a hospital or a childcare centre in areas that are flood prone. So, it's not just structural engineering fixes. There's other ways we mitigate. Or maybe it's emergency management. You tell everybody in that area, it doesn't look like it, but you are, subject to flooding. So, there's all sorts of things that get done, and councils are always doing this. Again, most people don't Google, but, if you want to go up and look at what your council's doing in that flood space for your catchment, it's probably available. And, after the flooding events of last year, we're actually trying to make it more accessible, that kind of information. A good test is, if you think about where you live, do you know what catchment you live in? How many of you know what catchment you live in? Anybody? Two people? Okay. Maybe that's homework, right? Go back, try and figure out what catchment you're in. Doesn't matter, you don't have to be in the Rockdale catchment, but it's good. It's good to have that kind of awareness, right? And like I said, we go and do it all over again, right? So like I said, this whole process takes decades. And as numerical modelers, we go back and we try and review, is there new guidance on sea level rise? Is there new guidance from Engineers Australia about how we should look at things? Is there new numerical models, new faster computers that we can use? So it's not just a do it once, forget. It's a, keep reviewing. What is the state of affairs? What has happened? Is the catchment we looked at 10 years ago suddenly got 20,000 more people living in it now, So that's what we do, and that's what pays the bills, right? That's why I have a job. Okay, so in terms of the Rockdale wetland specifically that you're looking at, so this is from the Bayside Council website. So that area is specifically covered by 3 main flood studies that have been undertaken by various consultants over the last 2 decades. So we've got the Bonnie Doon catchment, the Spring Street Drain, Muddy Creek and Scarborough Ponds, and also the Pebsand Susie down the end. But today, for our purposes of our talk, we'll just focus on the Muddy Creek and the Spring Drain and Scarborough Ponds catchments. Okay. So what are the flooding mechanisms? And, I think this is an important slide. And if you don't know much about overland flooding, I implore you to go and look at some videos that are on YouTube that BOM has released and SES as well. But so in terms of the flooding mechanism of that area, right, we're talking about trapped low points, which drain via culverts and ponds and channels into the Cooks River and obviously into Botany Bay. So that happens typically because of short duration, intense stormfall events. So we're talking thunderstorms, right? We're not talking days and days and days of rain, which is the type of mechanism that floods, for example, your big river systems. So, when you have your East Coast lows come in, you rain for a long time, you wet up the catchment, and, you flood your Georges River, Parramatta River, and last year, like we saw in Lismore and all sorts of that. But this type of flooding is overland flooding, and we're talking about really short duration, but really heavy events. Longer duration events tend not to be so intense. They just tend to be really consistent, and the volume of water is spread over longer. Whereas the volume of water is I think last year they used a term called rain bomb, right? So that's what I want you to imagine in your head. So, and again, like I said, this can happen in areas where you don't, you typically expect to be safe from flooding. So, you can walk down the street and have no idea that this is, a potentially dangerous flood zone, right? So, like Jamie said, so what have we done in the past? In the past, engineers, what do? We engineer our way out of the problem, right? If something's causing us problems, we concrete line it. And the reason we concrete line it, not because we like concrete, but because when you're in lower parts of the catchment and you're looking at something from a flood perspective, You want the water to get away as quickly as possible, right? You want the volume of water to go down. And the best way to do that is a concrete channel, right? The moment you start putting in plants and, features, what that's doing is it's did you guys do physics in first year? Yeah? You know what I mean when I say friction? Things that slow down water? Yeah? Okay, so the moment you start slowing down the water and holding it back from getting away as quickly as possible, what it's doing is that it's building it back up, right? And it's inundating more areas. And this is a problem, especially when you're in urban areas. So back in whenever this was built, engineers were very concerned about protecting humans and property, and probably not so much plants and ecology. So that was the best way to get the water out quickly, right? Through channelized systems and ugly concrete. And like I said, this is real, right? These are pictures that happen during probably not even the 1% event. I would say that bridge gets flooded maybe in the 5% or 10%. Don't quote me. We'll have a look. And again, a lot of the infrastructure isn't just owned by council; it's owned by Sydney Water, so it becomes really complicated, right? So, like I said, just a few notes on the the critical durations and the type of floodings that we are to expect. So this is another very important point, right? So the duration that produces the highest flow rate may not necessarily result in the peak flood. And what I mean by that is, you could have a really high, you think about a tap, right? You could have a really high flow rate on a tap, but depending on the shape of your bathtub, right, or the toys that you have in there or whatever, if you have kids, it might not produce the biggest level in terms of inundation, right? And that is very catchment specific. That will depend on your topography, what kind of obstructions you have, is there bridges and culverts and houses and fences. So that is why we spend years and years and years doing a hydrodynamic model to study the flood, right? So something that happens with a flow rate in Rockdale may not be the same as something that happens in Randwick. So, this is why we use numerical models and technical guidelines. And, there's people spending their whole life doing research in this space. And the other one is that I know when you think about climate change, you like to think about sea level rise, but there's also the other side of that, which is intense rainfall, right? Sea level rise will have certain impacts in tidal areas or lower parts of your catchment, whereas when we talk about this whole, Muddy Creek's spring vein catchment, there's other mechanisms at play too. So, and when the research is even more uncertain. You think sea level rise is uncertain? At least we have some, uncertainty around predictions of it. Whereas rainfall, it's just a whole degree more of uncertainty because we know on average it might change, it might go up or down. But, even when they talk about 1% change when it comes to IPCC and, when every time they release their reports, 1% when they talk about it means 1% of a year, right? So we're talking 3 days in a year, which is not the type of flooding we're talking about. 1% we're talking about here is, very rare events. So that's also another important consideration. So, don't just limit your mind to, sea level rise is the other side of it, which is intense rainfall. And the current knowledge, and again, this may change, check back in a year, but climate change will warm our atmosphere. It will increase the ability for clouds or the moisture holding capacity of our atmosphere, which means that more water can be held, therefore rain bombs potentially will be more intense, right? That's about how much we know about it. In obviously a lot more technical terms, go and read journals if you are interested in this space. But again, we don't actually know how much. And if you read the New South Wales Flood Risk Management Manual Guidelines, it will actually tell you, rather than getting fixated on, oh my God, how much is my rain going to increase, do a sensitivity test, right? So what they say is increase your rainfall, check a 0.05% event or a 0.2% event, see what it does to your catchment. If it's not too sensitive, then you're probably okay. If it is, then, it's time to think about it a little bit more. And, there are examples of catchments that are like that. There's a catchment in Canada Bay, people that know that area on the Parramatta River, that isn't that sensitive to rainfall. And it's more dominated by the sea level rise impacts, more so than rainfall impacts. So it's really important as designers to really understand the catchment you're designing, okay? Okay, so just some random snips from the flood study. These are all publicly available, so go and read it. Great bedtime reading if you have insomnia, like I said. So when you go about doing these hydrodynamic studies, you try and put in all the major creeks and the drains and the wetland areas, obviously, and the water courses. Can you see my mouse if I move it? Okay, right. So again, the sea level rise impacts mainly come from this end. So we're talking Cooks River, right? And obviously that's going to go up and down. But, you know, the influence of sea level rise might be maybe, you know, again, I don't know, have to go back to the hydrodynamic model, but maybe the influence is, you know, contained to a certain extent. When we talk about flooding of this area, you know, like I said, the mechanisms are different, right? So it's an interaction of both sea level rise and overland flood. And that goes back to the picture that Jamie showed with the tidal inundation. You know, we can engineer our problem, but, you know, we want water from a flood risk perspective to get away as quickly as possible, right? So in building the models, it's super complicated in urban area. It's really nice when you have greenfield or rural developments and you can just buy out a couple of farms and restore your wetlands. But we don't have the luxury of doing that in Sydney, unfortunately, because when you look at Sydney, each of those red bits is somebody's house, right? So when you build the models, you consider these things. So you put in the friction element. So something like a concrete road or like, you know, a roof surface obviously has a lower friction. So the water falling on those surfaces is quicker than something like grass where the friction is a bit higher. So, and, you know, these are published numbers that come out of books. So, you know, they're generally consistent. They don't change too much, but they do obviously get reviewed. So if you were to redo this flood study in 10 years' time, you might see that there's way more development, right? Or way more paved areas, or maybe not. Maybe landscape architect students like yourself have gone and found ways to do green spaces. But again, keeping in mind, when we're talking about rare floods, anything you design is probably going to get inundated in those events because you just don't design for those. So here's a snip of the flood risk as we know it for this catchment, right? So again, I know I kind of touched on what the 1% and the 5% means. I'm sorry if the colors are a bit hard to see here, but if you're interested, go back and read the flood study report. I think it's done by BMT. But basically, this shows you that in the 1% flood, like the blue areas are what's going to get inundated. So that's what we expect, right? Again, this is, like I said, an art form, you know, it's based on model predictions, which is probably got lots of science and things around it. But, you know, it's no different to when you're on the news listening to coronavirus modeling. And, you know, it is a model. It may not be perfect, but it's the best understanding that we have right now, right? So, you know, that's always also important to keep in mind that it's not absolute truth, but it's what we know. And so in that sense, it's showing you that, okay, in the 1% flood, these are the types of areas that will be inundated. And the pink represents the PMF. So the PMF is another way of thinking about the floodplain. So what is the probable maximum flood? So it's not the 1% event, but, you know, if there was in the entire, it relates to the PMP, which is the probable maximum precipitation. So if the entire like atmosphere was full of water and it dumped it, where does it go, right? And there's methods that are outlined by the Engineers Australia in ways you can calculate that kind of number for a catchment, and it comes from statistics, basically, rainfall records, right? So once we do a flood study, we get an understanding of our flood risk, right? So this is an example of the flood risk in the area that we're looking at. So I'll just tell you about what that means. So this is, again, getting really technical, but stop me if you don't understand what I'm talking about. So we have hazard maps that have been developed, again, with, you know, about 2 decades of research, where you can relate the depth of the water and the velocity of the water to the hazard, right? And UNSW was actually very, you know, like fundamental in developing this because, you know, we had professors back in the 70s who stuck their children in wave flumes and ran water and figured out when they're unstable and go, okay, yeah, that's the point on my graph where it's unsafe for children, right? So there is science behind all of this. And the way to think about it is if you have shallow water that's not moving very fast, it's probably not that hazardous, right? It's probably safe. If you have deep water that's not moving very fast, it's probably hazardous, right? Because you don't want to wade through water. There's, you know, chemicals and all sorts of pollutants in flood that you need to worry about. If you have shallow water, but it's moving super fast, that's hazardous too, because it might make you topple, right? You might knock you off your feet. If you have shallow water in your car, especially modern cars that are super buoyant because we have wonderful ACs and, you know, doors are closed. So it doesn't take much to lift up a car and float it away. And that's why every time there's a news article, it'll be like, don't drive through floodwaters. So, you know, so there is science behind these graphs, and this represents the flood risk for that catchment. So don't know if you can see, but, you know, red is bad, blue is H1. So you get an understanding of what is the flood risk in that area. And as you can see, it's high, right? Especially in the rarer events. And as when you go through the process of studying flooding in the catchment based on the New South Wales Floodplain Management Manual guidelines, you also look at emergency risk, right? So you look at, so a lot of the areas are flooded up to H3. So H3 is over here. So that's unsafe for vehicles, children, and the elderly. So, you also look at areas that are completely like you can't escape, right? So you have your high flood islands, your low flood islands, areas where, maybe your house is okay, but around you is flooded and your access routes are cut off. So, if you're having a heart attack or something, or your house is on fire, which often happens when you have, electricity and water mixing, can a fire engine get to you? So these are things that New South Wales SES mostly look at when they're developing their management plans. But again, this is a consideration. And we looked at that also. And, the intent is in designing the things that you design, you don't make these things worse, right? That's what we want to do. So what does that mean? Does that mean that we can do nothing? Does everything need to be concrete? Like, have we lost hope? Are people more important than plants? I don't know. And this is where you come in. And, and I just wanted to leave you guys with a message of hope in that this is a project, again, and you probably are familiar with this, but this is being undertaken in the Muddy Creek area that is, but it's being done by City Water. And I think it's still under construction, so I don't know if you'll see much of it, but that is their vision, right? So they're obviously trying to go back and do some of those things that we talked about when it comes to, the intention of restoring something. But, as you can see, they've still kept, the channels quite, not concrete, but, low friction, right? Because you want the water to get away. And obviously they've also, I haven't seen this flood study myself, otherwise I have some things in there for it, but basically before they did this work, they had to go through a process where they redid the flood study for that area and showed that, okay, we're going to do this. We know we're going to have an impact flooding, but how much is that impact? What is the afflux? What is the difference? Is that difference going to matter when it comes to what is the risk, right? Are we going to flood extra properties, or are we just going to flood a little bit more of the park, right? So there is rigorous studies that have gone to underpinning this, but yeah, so this is the ultimate vision of that area, which I think is already happening. So again, goes back to the point that they've kept the main channel quite fast flowing, but obviously they're trying to design around it. And the other thing to note about this is that whatever you design, you have to kind of make sure that it can be maintained, right? Because in 10, 15 years time, when there's a new councillor, a new council engineer, someone's not maintaining it, and you get obnoxious weeds growing, or you're just creating more problems because you might not know it, but then there might be a flood that comes through, and then all of a sudden it's just a lot harder for the water to get away, or the drains are blocked, or so that's also something we should consider, and also make really important to point out to the managers, right? Because everybody likes it when you design something new, there's a ribbon cutting ceremony, there's a pretty park, it looks beautiful, but when it comes to maintaining it, no one's interested, right? The funding for those things just kind of taper away, as opposed to when you first build something and you have millions of dollars to do it. Okay, that's all I had to say. Any questions? All right. Okay. Hope I didn't dishearten you with it anyway, but thought it was important you.
Well, this conversation of friction,
yes,
versus retention,
mm-hmm.
I suppose. Certainly, a lot of these sites are in that area and also further south. And so I think when I understand further south will be different again in that catchment, and perhaps more influenced by sea level rise.
Yes, so the more closer you are to the outlet, the more impact, the more influence tidal inundation has on your area.
So this friction issue is still an issue. In and out.
Yeah.
Versus just out.
Yeah. So it depends. Do you have tide gates, and if you improve the friction without a tide gate, you're actually improving the conveyance the other way as well. So you're allowing more tidal volume to get in as well as get out. So again, another thing to the mix.
Now, people haven't looked like next week is not bad. And Jamie and I had a quick email on it, and they had much larger areas for rhine to come down from the Alps into their delta system, which is actually their country, the Netherlands, and given it more room for the river. And Jamie, your comment to that was acid sulfate soils.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is one issue that you also have. Right? So it's no different to highly urbanized areas where we've got lots of cars and industry and all sorts of pollutants that sit on our catchment. And when it rains, all those pollutants either soak into the ground and then stay in the soil and they can bioaccumulate over time, or they just get washed off into the river and they get into the sediments in the river, or they go downstream and they're just carried out to the ocean. And then, that can also affect fish and stuff that are living in that area as well. So the concept of acidic soils is when those soils are wet, they're fine, they're benign. When you expose them to oxygen, they release sulfuric acid essentially, locally H water, it is picked up by rain and moved into the waterways. So we don't want to make those things any worse than they are. Up and down the east coast of Australia, as I was saying, all those red lines I showed you on that map before, they've exposed thousands and thousands of hectares of acid soils. Every one of our estuaries in New South Wales is completely affected by the runoff from those soils, and then also fish kills and other things that relate to that. So you have to consider not only the water moving in and out, but if I go and move some soil around on my site, is that contaminated soil, and is that going to cause more environmental issues to fix?
So the answer is going to be yes and yes.
Yes, yes. And so it comes back to when you talk about the Netherlands program that they're trying to do, they're saying, okay, we want to increase the volume of our floodplain so that we can take more water and we'll have these rain volume events. And, provided they have room to actually do that in the lower floodplain areas. Excavating the soil of that floodplain, well, that is one solution and can give you an increase in capacity. So are the problems that come from it worse than the problems of not doing that? Are there other solutions that you can look at rather than digging out the floodplain? There's a whole range of things.
So I'll just add to that comment as well. So yes, again, and this is why you talk to a different engineer that just does that as their life, right? But particularly in that area, like near the Cooks River, or because we're just talking about really urbanized and there's legacy issues with contamination. So it's probably, I'm not a betting person, but there would be heavy metals and contaminants of concern in that area, right? But with regards to what the Netherlands is doing, so I just want to show you this picture, right? So if you, not suggesting you do, but if you look at the New South Wales Floodplain Development Manual, it basically tells you so when you do a flood study, you categorize it, right? So the middle, where the most 80% of the water flows through, that's called a floodway, right? You do not want to be building things on a floodway. If you build things on a floodway, you have inevitable impacts upstream, right? Then there's the next bit, which is called the flood fringe, right? In the flood fringe, you can have small things happen, and it has less of an impact, it's less pronounced. And then you obviously have your flood storage, which only come online when you have rare flood events, and that acts as kind of, areas that flood and I guess hold water but then release away again, right? In the Netherlands, they're just kind of, it's not really different to what we do here, but basically they're reimagining the concept of the floodway and trying not to build on the floodway, right? So they're keeping that area free, which is not too different from what our advice in New South Wales is as well. So if you look at that, it's just, different names, same thing. In terms of, dredging things and, increasing, all you're doing by dredging it out is you're giving it more volume. You're increasing the capacity. If we go back to talking about something that's easy to understand, so for example, Warragamba Dam, that was really topical, with raising the wall, or, it's like, okay, if we raise the wall to mitigate flood risk because, you're holding back more water and you're letting the downstream areas of Windsor and Richmond be flood free for a bit longer. When you hold back water, you inundate areas that are probably ecologically significant. There's Aboriginal sites there that, might be, irrecoverable if you do that. So there's all sorts of environmental and heritage concerns, but when you do inundate it, it's for a very short period of time. You're going to go back to that level, like the water supply level of Warragamba Dam. So the other option is, why don't we dredge it out, increase the volume from lower below. But, when you start looking at it, you actually have to dredge a lot to get the same impact as you would as increasing it a bit more, right? Just because of the volume. Yes.
Yeah. They're not going to be in the amount.
That's right. Yeah. So there's also, again, you have to probably study it from a sediment dynamic perspective, and maybe if you do dredge it, the next time there's a flood, you're just going to get siltation anyway, and you have to keep dredging it. Yeah.
And I guess the other thing with the Newcastle and the entrance dredging is that obviously if you're maintaining a clear entrance, that will help with the removal of flood water. But if you just take, as Graham saying, just taking a little bit off the bottom to allow a bigger ship to come in, it's not really going to change how flooding. It's already wet, so it's not going to change how flooding happens.
Yeah, it's the residual. It's the bit that's on top that's available for the water to get through. So it's complicated.
Would it make, is there any sense in dredging there in the sense it's not water in and out, it's water down and out, or that it's retained, detained,
Detention? Yeah. So, maybe you probably have to study that through your numerical model, just as a case, like a sensitivity case, where you increase the volume and see what happens when you get that kind of flow rates come through. The thing about permanent wetlands is that you could have a detention basin that's empty, and basically, usually they're ugly looking things with grass mounds just because it's easy to mow them, right? Yeah, or football fields, exactly. And your water comes through and you have that volume of water being held back. When you're talking about, wetlands or, systems that are designed to improve water quality and, aesthetics and amenities, that bit's already full. So the bit that's left over to catch that extra bit of water is not very much. So there's considerations around that as well. And what are you trying to optimize? And, people love water, right? Humans love water. Every time there's a river view or a water view or a wetland view or a sea view, people just want to live there and build there, right? Which makes it harder because then you just all of a sudden have all these more people that are at risk, and you're trying to protect them at the same time as protecting the trees. So it is very much competing interests, but I won't have an answer for you as to what will happen in this particular catchment. I would recommend, if you are investigating those types of solutions, the best thing, the quickest thing, the most cost-effective thing to do is get the numerical model that's existing for this area and, calibrate it and up to date to our best understanding. Just run as a sensitivity, dredge it out, lower the bathymetry, run the model again, see what happens. Are you increasing the hazard? What is your influx? Are you increasing the inundation? And that's what we do as engineers, right? We come up with ideas, you test them, you see if they stack up. And that's what that management study phase is all about in those 10 years, right? Where like a consultant does the flood study, but then another consultant comes in and goes, okay, what can we do to reduce the flooding? But, there are principles in the manual that says, you have to be ecologically sustainable or as possible. But, no doubt in your career, you'll come up with all sorts of buzzwords, right? And it changes every decade. I think the big one now is nature-based solutions, but how much can you use nature to stop flooding is probably still under research, right? Because typically, we've just engineered our way out of the problem by putting in concrete that take away water faster, whereas, nature has the effect of slowing water down. So that's not to say it's not possible. There are examples of where, mangroves are being used to attenuate the water and, all sorts of things. But my advice is, be cynical, study your area, see if it works for your catchment, because things that work for one catchment won't work for another one. So, you don't want to make broad-based statements about having something as a solution. You want to test it out site-specific with the constraints of that area. If that makes sense.
Right, Smoke. Thank you. Really appreciate it. I actually love this stuff, mainly because I think probably as landscape architects, you're not engineers. It's really important to understand that these guys provide inputs but it also forces, because in fact, the slide I've enjoyed the most for you was the last one, because you have 2 publications. Can you just put that last slide back up? And because yeah, there we go, not the last one.
That one?
That one, yeah. So you say current thinking is highly focused on engineering science impacts, not long-term solutions, and need to develop new approaches to planning the future. That's the call to you from evidence-based scientists, and engineers are scientists. One of the things I think is really interesting from that whole conversation is, first of all, there's an underlying premise for all of your work that the priority is to preserve human-made infrastructure, human settlement and the like. But we know around the world, international examples, like, for example, the capital of Jakarta, of Indonesia, Jakarta, 4th most populous nation in the world, is moving its capital to high ground. Okay, so they've thrown in the towel. They've said, we don't have any of the solutions that you proposed for large-scale human occupation. And one of the constraints that we're still thinking around is how do we manage this open space to protect the existing way of existing on that peninsula? Okay. Now, I know it's not for you guys to go, okay, well, let's just trash all the houses. I mean, if you go to Detroit or somewhere like that in the US, there's a whole areas of abandoned infrastructure, and it's not pretty. Okay. But one of the things that's really important for you guys to understand is that sometimes, particularly as students, you can propose or put propositions forward, which was like, actually, maybe that's something we need to think about. And that's a really important opportunity that is presented to you by hearing this, because the new approaches to plan for the future is somewhere between everything staying the way it is, people living in those little houses the way they are, and something radical. Either one of those solutions is probably not acceptable. There was a wonderful paper that was written about geoengineering, like the big solution of putting a gate across the front of Botany Bay as an example of geoengineering solution. The worst outcome from that is everybody inside that bay thinks nothing's going to change. Okay, because then their mindset is, oh, we're protected. We don't need to change anything. We can maintain the status quo because there's a nice big engineered solution to protect us from future uncertainty. Okay, now that's probably the worst outcome from a big geoengineering approach. So I would say to you, and we'll go through this process, won't we, Patrick, is that the scenario in which the people on that peninsula's life isn't going to change because somehow we're going to come up with solutions to stop that from being the case is not an option. And it's not an option now because we've already talked about the flooding events that have happened even this year. So in some regards, you do need to talk, even if it's just education, even if it's being able to say to the residents, guess what, the low tide isn't going to be there anymore, it's going to be here. And whether it's done through artwork or whether it's done through education, that's something that introduces the possibility that humans may have to give over to nature in this particular scenario. And this is where we really need to start challenging some of the current thinking. And when I say current thinking, it's the current thinking of the decision makers, the policy makers, who say the priority here is not to let poor Mr. Jones living in 21 whatever street have to consider that his place might flood. Okay.
100% agree with what you said. And yeah, and again, in the management plans, there are considerations of doing mitigations through land use planning, whether it's, raise your house higher or move away altogether, or, but often, again, like with anything else, you have to manage conflicting priorities because it will depend on the councillor at the time, the politicians at the time, or the which principle is higher at that given in time in terms of, is there a housing shortage and you can't have people do that. So it's definitely a challenge. And, this is why I have hope. And I guess education is the best way to do that, is that, as a landscape architect with completely different mind, and the way your mind works is not the way mine works. Okay, you might have, like Jane said, solutions that I probably don't even think about. Get involved. Join your flood risk management committee. Go to your councils that display these studies when they're being done. propose a solution when the consultant goes to the community and goes, hey, community, do you want to see certain things happen? You know, put in your radical idea so that when they're making these studies, they can test it and then, you know, see if it's good or bad, or, you know, and that's probably the most grassroots way you can get involved in actually making a difference, right? Because otherwise it probably will be status quo and up to higher powers than probably myself to decide these things.
Thank you.
Thank you for this. Just before we both go, I mean, I feel I'm the Indigenous speakers, historians, this idea of deep time. Like, can you give us a sense how, let's say, government level, what kind of time span people are put to that, those two words, deep time? Certainly local council thinking about 20 years, maybe 25 years. Is state government or federal government?
So from a flooding perspective, whenever we study something, or even, you know, we get hundreds of planning proposals and state significant developments come into our door that I look at and comment on. So in terms of flood risk, we look at the 1% flood to make some of our sort of engineering decisions. So going back to your point about barrages, right? Anything that's engineered has a life, right? It doesn't have a permanent flood immunity. It might have an immunity to 1%, or, you know, again, in Lismore, there was levees, right, that protected people from the 1% flood. And so again, they were complacent and not expecting it. So when it reached the 1% flood and went over, it was a problem, right? So so when we assess things, we look at the PMF. So we look at the absolute potential when it comes to deciding whether something should go there or not. So there is that precedent that it is very long term. But in terms of like, you know, planning decisions or strategic decisions, usually it's based on the 1% plus some kind of freeboard. But yeah, so the planning horizons for flooding are a lot higher than the planning horizons for potentially the CMPs and water qualities. So in that respect, it's, you know, a little bit better. Sorry?
Well, in that respect, it's a bit longer.
It's longer term, yes, definitely. But again, these things get reassessed because, you know, you might study a catchment that could look nothing like a catchment in 10 years' time. So it changes. With regards to deep time, I don't know, like I forgot to do this in the beginning. Yeah.
Shortening that time.
Right, yes.
Forward
yeah.
Not getting further away. So
yeah, so the current recommendation in the guidelines is that you do it as a sensitivity test for the catchment. So with the rainfall, you check the 0.2 and the 0.05. With sea level rise, there's a table, and that tells you if you're planning something that has a 100-year horizon, so a house or, you know, something, you know, more low risk, or not low risk, but with a lower time horizon, you probably build it to a certain degree and you consider this level of sea rate. If you're building critical infrastructure like a bridge or a railway or a hospital that has a bigger design life, then you should consider this as your. So there is elements of it built into it, and those guidance get changed every time there's a new.
And I've certainly seen new houses being built, dropped out.
Yeah.
When I drive down,
They're higher? Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. There you go.
They're under construction now. You know, you think in the beginning, government. Really, I think, what is your lifespan? Well, how's that got to the council? Is what I mean.
Right.
From what we know from the State of Environment Report, I think, how is that thing getting built here?
Okay. Well, okay. I understand your question now.
So I just want to ask you, like,
yeah,
how is that really hitting the ground at state level? And how's that?
Okay. So with state government level, we actually push councils to consider their flood risk, right? In terms of councils are responsible for their like their LEPs or their DCPs or their flood planning controls. So when you talk about a house in Rockdale, the Bayside Council would have, you know, in their policy, they'd be like, okay, we've done a flood study, we've studied our flood risk. People that are within this area, obviously, you know, there are, when you do a flood study, there are houses and properties that get identified for voluntary purchase or voluntary house raising, right? And the reason they get identified is because the velocities and the hazard is too high in that area. It's not feasible for a house to get built up there because it just get washed away, right? So those things are flagged, and maybe there's 5, 10, 15, 100, again, depends on the catchment, that the council know, okay, we have to voluntarily purchase them if and when the landowners want to sell. The other houses that are within the floodplain, because, you know, you don't want to over-sterilize the floodplain either, because, again, we're talking about rare events and there's a housing crisis, right? So what they then do is through their LLP, they have flood planning controls, and that comes into your certificates, planning certificates, where you go, okay, you were here, we've identified you as a flood risk person. Maybe we didn't in the past because we didn't know any better. But now that we know better, if you want to rebuild your house, you can rebuild it, but we're going to give you planning controls to do it. So you will have to build to the 1% flood level plus a bit of freeboard, right? So that's typically what most councils in Sydney do and adopt. There hasn't been any kind of radical, like, we're just not going to build on this floodplain. That just hasn't happened. And to be honest, I don't see it happening politically either. So, but yes, there are things that they do, but their ultimate aim is to protect this to life and property, essentially, right? That is what their objective is, objective function is. Did I answer your question?
Yeah. Thank you.
It's all right. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Everyone, what's the time now?
20 past.
20 past, we'll take like a class. And then second, we'll go to 1 o'clock.
Qualifications, there we go.
Patrick, I can send you that presentation too if you wanted to.
That'd be great.
Share that.
I mean, yeah, everything I put on is public. I just don't have a reference. Maybe I should ask.
I know it does.
It's all publicly available, so it's not.
Thank you for that. Sorry, I didn't mean to pin you there.
That's all right. No,
But
no.
when I drive around, I go, I can't reconcile the information I'm looking at on coastalwest.com as used by the federal government with local buildings going up.
It's complicated, and when you look at, unless it's a, like I said, it all depends on what they've adopted as their risk tolerance, right? If it's 1%, that's all they're considering. And yes, the coastal risk map shows you, okay, so you might be inundated, so maybe you have building repairs to backward, or like I said, there are properties that are heavily impacted, flagged for voluntary purchase, but again, it's voluntary, right? People don't like giving up where they live. And even though, like, there's examples in Fairfield Council, when they studied the Georges River, there was like a whole street of houses that got flagged for pulling away, right? But, you know, there's elderly people that live there, they don't want to move. They've lived there, they've grown up there. And so for about 15 years, Fairfield LGA has been trying to purchase them out. And I think only end of last year it came online because they're old enough that I think one person passed on and the other one's moving into a nursing home. And only now are their kids amenable to selling it. So it's not just this side, it's the other side too.
There's more, there's speculation on vacant land. You know, people are coming in, buying off the vacant land and putting an even cheaper house on than it was in the past. Because they're just hedging that to like, well, someone's going to want to live there. And they'll end up being permanent renters because the rent is going to come and but yeah, no, the market's well and truly, like, floods are a good opportunity for speculation.
And like, you know, it's topical because it happened last year. Everyone's thinking about it. We're entering a lot El Nino, so you know, in 5 years' time, flooding's not even a conversation. Sure, we'll keep doing the work. It'll be about desal plants.
You know, we should do a study of the student projects and align them with the conditions requirements. Because I can assure you, in the early 2000s, we were doing fire. Everything was fires and droughts.
Yeah. So, and it will, next time there's a La Nina and a triple La Nina event, we'll talk about this again. Oh, maybe I'll be retired by then.
No, it'll come along long before that.
Right.
Oh, yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, it's interesting.
You know, one of the Austin's most difficult things because it's just so
Dynamic.
We can have a half hour.
Good luck.
All right.
Thank you. We'll see you around, mate.
We will. See that video. It's quite interesting the way that
It's really but then it changes again because you go the state government has to and yes, But again, it's legislation, right? And I remember in 2016 when state government wanted to release a policy about criminalise the gossip area, they just said, no, you're not having it. You know, and that you can do it because it's not just one person's opinion.
It's also insane that we have like management groups in England has a different like civil rights projection in Wales, and like local governments are saying no, we're not going to design that, agree with that science, like we love it.
Yeah, you don't. It's so funny.
What happens in that?
In terms of, oh my God, it's like, well, most of the data is international, but in terms of political decision making, everything happens in the so there's like, so the thing is so interesting here, the thing about the whole thinking about here is protecting it as a fixed asset, and the village based environment like the beach, the problem of accommodation is not a problem that it's garden, it's living, it's water quality, erosion, all those kind of things that are essential to life.
In the area, like I didn't do an ecology in the country, but Gadigal and the Bidjigal people, they did exactly the same thing. They were coastal people that just moved around.
I mean, there's some big, but there's some wonderful, and that's the thing, and that's the assumptions about human preponderance to say, well, we need this fixed asset, because a lot of the thinking around Indigenous communities, and not just in Australia, but in the Pacific, not having fixed as such, because they live in environments where they're constantly adapting.
Incredibly sustainable.
What is adapting? Constantly being able to adapt to the
Alright,
Super. Okay. Not the other cards for go on. There's some heavy thinking.